Right. So the reason we're here is because of this issue 326, where we're discussing on how we want more people to feel comfortable contributing to the metrics catalog. The short terms, that means like the mundane things like updating SLIs, SLOs, adding services, that kind of thing. But in the long term, we also want to have it a bit more maintainable, so more people understand how the pieces fit together. And yeah, the ideas we've already discussed there briefly are the long-term goal that Nick was explaining of breaking the whole catalog up into monitoring units, which means that in essence, if I got it right, it's statically defining everything in YAML or YAML or whatever, statically defining everything. And that generates recording rules and everything in a way that is understandable. Another idea that Andrew put forth was, first of all, starting with taking our existing metrics catalog and generating that static config from it. So that means that our bunch of JSONet would generate one or more YAML files that are human readable. And then those YAML files are used to generate the config that goes into Mimir. And yeah, that was the second idea. And then a smaller thing to do was refactoring what we have a little bit. So it's easier to write DocSonnet documentation on the fields, and that way have generated documentation that always up to date that people can follow. I think we're all in agreement that we're not super confident that this is going to get us very far, because we already have quite good documentation, albeit a little bit outdated, that people aren't finding. So that's where we are. Andrew, you've added something below. You want to verbalize that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my mic was on as well. No, I think we all sort of like vaguely aligned. Like I was looking at what we can do with what we've already got, and like I was thinking it would be quite easy to almost take, like, imagine you had a renderer that took like web.json it, like services web.json it, and then actually, because that file, well, that JSON it already has access to the service catalog, right? And so you could quite easily spit out a YAML, call it like web service.yaml, which is like that piece of the service catalog plus that metrics catalog piece kind of into a single static file that's got all the SLIs. And there'll be a lot of repetition in there, which is fine. I think like repetition is not a problem in this case. And then
as long as it's generated.
Yeah, as long as it's generated, but it's kind of like the intermediate. And then I think the part that I feel more strongly about is like around like statically typing those definitions and making them more statically typed than the sort of nebulous JSON, which just kind of like we all just add features in there, and if they've all got defaults, so no one knows what you can and can't do, because if you don't add this key field, then it falls back to default, but it makes it quite sort of poor developer experience because people, and so we render that out.
If we render that out, there's no more defaults because everything, like, we will have a lot of repetition as you mentioned, but everything is together. So
yeah. And it's like side note, like I would really love it if you could take a default from JSON schema and put it into what we're doing, but you can't. I think once you've got a schema, then we can start looking at things like Q and all of that. Like we can, we could have, like if you look what Grafana's done with their schemas for all of their plugins and everything, they've sort of gone one step further back from like JSON schema, and they've gone to Q, and then that generates like clients for Golang and JSON schema and TypeScript and everything else. So they've and I think that like that might be something that we do later on, because we'll probably find that we need more flexibility there. And you know, Q is kind of more, I think, focused on that generating other things from a schema than JSON is. But I also don't want to kind of like we as a first step, we can generate a schema, and then we can look at like abstracting.
When you say generate a schema, do you mean like what you just said, the YAML file that is web.yaml that has SLIs in it and all of that? And because when I also understand, and I think we should have it, is have JSON schema for validating those things.
Yes.
In the future when
and we can even probably like generate the YAML for the first pass of that JSON schema, and then use, you know, there's plenty of tools that will take a YAML file and generate a schema for you, and then you obviously tweak it and then turn it into and that schema, I think, and this is kind of more like an implementation detail, but I think that we should have a definition of a service, which is kind of like what we've got in our service catalog at the moment. But then the SLI itself should be kind of independently defined, right?
I like that. Like,
and then because, you know, we were talking about user journeys the other day, right? And a user journey is like an SLI that's become detached from a service because it can kind of run. But if those are using a single definition of an SLI, but the one is kind of embedded in a service and the other one is not, then we can start like, you know, reusing things in that way and composing.
I like the way we've already kind of done this for saturation points, where we've got an applies to and so on. Right now in our SLIs, we already have SLIs in services that span multiple services. Like we use client-side metrics for the server-side SLI, for example, for Redis. So SLIs already know that they could be emitted by a different type than the type they're defined in. But I like the idea of decoupling that in YAMLs. Nick,
you mentioned the example of generating something from like the web service, for example. Would we not want a generic service definition and a generic SLI definition that for any new service you can start with a templated YAML file and have it feed into the JSON from there, just with the YAML parser?
So we start. You mean we start with the
from the other
thing
side
that someone adds is a. I'm up for either. Like that to me, as long as we have a good definition and we're validating it at that YAML stage, I'm less worried about that.
I actually have an old tool I wrote that takes a JSON schema and reads in YAML files and validates it against a JSON schema. I could probably surface that up.
Well, I mean, that's useful. What you know. We do that a lot on the dedicated side of things, right? Because we've got this idea. I don't know if you know the architecture, but we've got a tenant model, and the tenant model is kind of our definition of a tenant. It's got like all the variables that kind of count for that tenant, and that's got a JSON schema as well. So here it is.
I guess if we revisit the initial problem statement, I don't think any level of JSONet training is going to sufficiently give someone confidence in operating Runbooks in the short term. So if we can abstract away from that and make it easier to digest via something like YAML, it's going to go a long way to making that easier, I think, for a lot of people.
So you think that the raw state is YAML rather than like we don't generate that YAML from JSON. We start with
we generate a YAML
the initial,
from the JSON definition, the initial one.
Then we drop it,
and then we have a schema we can work off. And as long as we have a strict schema, then we can just render that or read that YAML into the JSON and pass through the values from there.
I mean,
so
like
you're doing it from the other side. You're doing it from the other side. Like you would take what is currently defined in the JSONet, generate a YAML from it, and then kind of remove the JSONet and start using the YAML as a source. Got it right?
Yeah, and when I say remove the JSONet, I'm not we're not removing too much here. We're just
no,
removing
just
the service definition.
yes,
the declaration, right?
the declaration
Correct.
that we, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the question there is does that get us any further along with ease of understanding, making changes? How many things are we presenting at the service level or service definition where we have our service level indicators that cater to 90% of a SRE's use cases versus how many of them do they need to leave that file when that is where the problem becomes.
So the kind of things where I think it would be like, there's a lot of definitions that are shared.
Using archetypes
requests.
and
there's lots of, and that's one of the places where I think being able to change it in one place and then kind of get it in 4 different service definitions is quite nice. And I'm not like, I'm just, presenting that as something. So then we kind of going back to the original problem where we were, having to tell people you forgot to update this file. And that's kind of where the JSON journey started, right? Was like, oh, to change an SLI, you need to change these 6 different places just to get your change in.
Yeah, I'm understanding now. So you're saying we actually have a definition that changes all the source references where they need to. Okay.
And
that would go a long way to helping, I think. Yeah.
What if we try to do, I don't know if it's too big of a chunk to do at first, but what if we already do this separation of SLIs from services? So we actually define an SLI and then in the service define or somehow link up which SLIs apply to which services, so we can avoid that repetition that we currently have in 2 different ways or 3 different ways.
Right. But yeah.
The reason I like Nick's idea is because it immediately gets us the goal of what started this issue. We have YAML files that are validated and that SREs are more confident updating and changing and adding.
Yeah.
At least you get the immediate feedback. I still think there is a problem when you leave those simple definitions, which Andrew's alluding to here, which is when you have to make nested changes that are buried deep within the JSON, often in multiple files. How can we ease that interaction?
So one of the things so if we say we're going to like a YAML definition, right? And it's very strongly typed, we have like a shared set of type definitions that define like what those schemas look like. One of the things we can start doing is making so the first thing is it doesn't need to be, as long as you've got a good abstraction, the implementation doesn't need to be JSON-ed. So if there's a team that are building something, the abstraction is the JSON schema and the type definition, not the implementation. So you're kind of going away from that. I think there's some pretty good reasons why people use configuration languages, but that's a separate discussion. But then the other part about it is even less than that. You can have smaller kind of pieces, right? Like, so the part of our configuration that generates dashboards could be its own module, its own project that's completely unrelated to the part that generates recording rules.
It just consumes the same YAMLs as the source.
They all just consume, and so we're making those things smaller. And we're at the moment, it's like a big bundle of mud, right? Like everyone's kind of aware that it's a pretty deep stack when it's running through that stuff.
I think it's worth thinking short-term versus long-term, because I think when we talk long-term,
I think this can be
a lot more opportunity to do bigger things.
I think this
like
is midterm, like extracting the API for SREs out. Like we don't think that needs to be a huge project. Like as long as we can feed it kind of into our existing rule generation, which I think we would be able to do, then we're fine. And then the long-term thing of breaking up the generation and the dashboarding into separate projects, and that's something that can follow onto that.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of cool things we could do long term as well. But yeah, I think short term, it's just how do we remove that challenge of following the where is this parameter set and which library files and how many of them do I need to change?
So what about as like a very short-term solution? The first thing is we like decouple, we put that YAML file in the middle and we make it that there's the JSON that generates that YAML file and then the JSON that consumes that YAML file as two stages. And then that first, sorry, JSONet that generates the YAML and then the JSON that consumes it. And as the first step, we do that and we put a schema around it. And then we think about actually dropping that first JSON and kind of get a feel for if that makes sense, you know, if people are happier to work in, you know, YAML definitions rather than, it'd be interesting to see how big it is. Because I mean, the other problem that just springs to mind is that the service catalog got really big at one point. And like way too big. I mean, there's like, you know, business use cases and technical use cases and like a lot of stuff that I don't think anyone actually gets value from. And then we started shrinking that down, but I don't know where that's at the moment. Like, I don't know if those files are now like full of information that's valuable or if there's just a lot of kind of boilerplate in there. But
yeah,
like, do we want to bring all of that in?
It's been improved. I think it's very valuable right now if we're going down the YAML direction to try to make it so we have one file, because what we're seeing often now is people add something to the service catalog because it's easier and it's just a YAML. They add a thing there and then there's nothing in the metrics catalog. So we have a service that has no metrics and no observability or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they go in and they add a manual alert in YAML for their own thing. And then, yeah, I think that's
I mean, that's another question as well. How many things could we simplify by presenting them in the service definition as another question? When you need to escape the service definition, should the user need to do that? Could we add a simple list of additional recording rules where you could just specify ad hoc recording rules to get them away from those manual definitions?
I think it would be fine to add, like that could be part of the service definition where you add your own rules or whatever if you want to. But if you define structured SLIs, then you get a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would push away from that because that goes down the route towards, you know, single threshold alerts that then become noisy alerts, you know, that might not have, you know, if you look at that example that we had the other day of somebody trying to do the right thing and adding, you know, an alert that should have been an SLI. If we're going down the route of just like raw recording rules, I think you kind of go into that territory. The other thing that I think is important is that we want to try and make things so that we're able, the architecture encourages the targeting of cells, dedicated, and .com, right? Actually, that has some impact on that whole idea of YAML as the first stage, because what's going to happen is, actually, I suppose it's happening at the moment anyway. There's not a lot of shared definition between the actual SLI definitions on the reference architectures and .com. They're kind of built
sometimes they're shared.
They follow the same concept, but they aren't that shared. I'm aware of time, and I just want to bring up two other points that I just have on my stack. The first one is I invited Andreas. He couldn't make it to this call because you know, he's trying to spec out this tenant observability module, which is something we already have in dedicated, and we're looking to kind of bring it out. And one of the things around that is we need to have it that each cell is going to, and each dedicated tenant, we're getting to the point where at the moment we've got like a one-size-fits-all metrics catalog. It gets generated, it gets stored in Instrumenter and then deployed. And it's getting to a point where that doesn't work anymore because there are different configurations that we need to have per cell, per tenant, but it will also be the case per cell. And so the way that we've kind of spoken about that is using, we'll basically put the configuration into a CRD, and then there's like a small little operator, very simple operator, it picks that up and it does the generation and then emits a bunch of Grafana dashboards, a bunch of recording rule objects in, all of these as Kubernetes resources, right? And so recording rules, alerts, and Grafana dashboards. And obviously that configuration ties very much into this because it should use the same kind of approach with the same static definitions. And it will obviously be using the generators that kind of come out of this process. But then it's almost like one level ahead of that, where it's, changing stuff that will apply across multiple. In fact, that's actually something we hadn't discussed. So for per cell and per tenant, there's kind of global configuration that we want to change across like lots of definitions. And that goes back to saying we want that to be JSONet rather than YAML, because we don't want to be doing like search and replace in a YAML file to change.
But if a single tenant needs to have a validated YAML in between, how you generate that YAML is up to.
Exactly. That's what, and that even so for GitLab.com, we might want to just keep it static, and then for the cells and tenants, we still use a JSON file for that. And there's actually a really good example of that in it's not really, but there's a little SLO generator which unfortunately we can't use because we've kind of gone down our own route and we preceded by quite a long way. But Matthias is the person who built that. One of the things that's really cool about Sloth is that it does exactly the same thing, where it's got a CRD that's well defined and well typed. And then they've got a very tiny little operator using this very straightforward Go framework that pretty much does exactly this one thing. I forgot its name now, but you can figure it out pretty quickly. And it just basically picks up changes and generates. And that could be effectively like, if you take JSON tool and our definitions and that operator framework and put them together, it could be something along those lines. But the main thing there is having the schemas and the types and having like a well-defined way of doing that. So I think there's a lot to learn from what he did, and I think it's kind of the modern way maybe of doing it, but it's worth looking at. And then the other thing, go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, tying into that, one of the ideas Taliesin and I sort of were talking about is taking a similar model to Sloth, where we actually have the main guts of the generation done through a Golang application, but leveraging Q for the templating in the background, because that also gives you dependency management and all the nuts and bolts with versioning and stuff out of the box.
So I mean, it's up for discussion. Nice. There's a lot of like Q, I find in my experience is more for like generating. Yeah, I mean, we can discuss that, but I think there's a lot of stuff in JSONet that would, all the stuff around generating PromQL and all of that stuff. Q, I find people tend to be using more for like the validation side and like almost the language generation. So like generating the Go and the gRPC definitions and all of those things, rather than like where we're using JSON, it is more like emitting other stuff. That's kind of complicated. Like
with the problem of the type validation and proper schema validation,
because JSON is horrible for validation, right? I mean, I think that's where we've all, but I think you can split those problems up. But I think these things are all up for discussion. Like, but the first step is maybe bringing in that intermediate stage. But the last thing I just wanted to quickly bring up is the operations team are in the process of building all of these markdown files, like for every alert. So we've got, you know, web service, Puma, aptX violation. And obviously those are generated, you know, as an alert. But the operations team are busy writing out like markdown files, which is like, when you see this, like, this is all the stuff. And, you know, so they're kind of trying to get on top of all of those. And obviously there's a slight imbalance because on the one side, it's kind of generated from the SLIs. And on the other side, it's like unstructured text. And what would be nice is like, can we do this in a way that we kind of bring them into the fold a little bit more on this? Like one option would be, like for each service, we have a subdirectory. This is just like a simple proposal. There's probably better ones, right? But like, so the web service is like in a subdirectory. It has like the definition.yaml, whatever. And then these kind of files that these folks are building, these markdown files, are inside that structure. One, just so that we keep it all structured and aligned. And, you know, when you remove a service, you can kind of automatically remove those markdown files. But then also we can think about, like, is there a way to repackage this for other service, you know, for Get or for dedicated or even for self-managed customers? It's just something to think about because I know they're putting quite a lot of effort into that at the moment.
Yeah, I had a similar idea with again, the generic term monitoring unit, where Runbooks would be a part of that. Anytime you're generating SLIs or a service definition, it should be an option to, or even a requirement to have Runbooks to go with it. So I quite like that idea. And then, you know, for our own generation, if we do that, we could host them through GitLab pages for community users to just reference our own Runbooks, even if they don't use our monitoring tools. I mean, which would be nice.
Yeah, at the moment, the dedicated ones don't even point back to the Runbook kind of files because it's kind of hard to do that actually at the moment. So yeah, having that in a better structured format would be great.
So short term, midterm, short term, generating this kind of YAML inside a directory from our JSON definitions and keeping that up to date.
And it's this YAML where users would go to make changes.
I think in the short term, long term, yes.
Yeah.
So right, step one, it would be generated.
Generated,
I think. Yeah. While because the thing is there's a lot of stuff to move over.
And we need to discuss the proper API for these things because we will see a bunch of repetition. Like if we just take what we have now and generate, we'll see a bunch of repetition, and we're going to see how we want to structure the spec and what kind of validation we want to add. So I think it's a good place to start. Then we've got those files. We could decouple the rule generation and so on, which might bring benefits like doing more rule generation in parallel, which could improve the user experience if you need to run make generate and so on. But the long-term goal is removing the service definition.json files that generated these YAMLs initially and just have the YAMLs.
Also, the other thing that kind of works against doing it too soon is there's a lot of stuff outside the Runbooks project that relies on like the service catalog. So we're going to have to maintain that file for a while. Because we need to figure out all of those consumers.
I didn't think about that. Do we want to, in this step, merge the service and metrics catalog into?
I feel like if we don't do it, it will never happen.
So let's do it.
and that service catalog, it's always been awkward that there's two things. I do have to run though. I'm late for another call, but
yeah, no worries.
Yeah, let's carry on just talking about this though. I'll come back and I'll look at what you've put under here as well. But yeah,
I'll summarize on the issue as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks.
Okay.
Folks.
Cheers, Andrew.
Bye.
Yeah. So generate YAML definitions. We are going to validate those against a schema.
The first instance, I would just generate them because we're not doing anything with them yet. then look at what is in there, like the information. Do we? Because like if we dump everything in there, there will be probably information that we don't need for certain parts. And like, yeah, I think we need to look at what is in there and what we need where, and then we can see how we separate these things. Because I think it might be a good idea to thinking about this monitoring units and see how we can separate that out of the definition already. So we just have like the service definition and a monitoring unit, and then it's easy to see which monitoring unit applies to which service definition if we do the merging of the service and metrics catalog as they stand.
I mean, I'm all for merging those. I often end up in the wrong directory when I'm looking for one or the other. So I think merging those is good. Do we have an idea of how many services might be consuming those files at the moment?
The metrics catalog, I think we're quite okay. That's just in the Runbooks. No, there's also the maturity model that is in the handbook. There's a bunch of stuff in the handbook that is using the service catalog. But if we merge them all together, like first step would be merging the two files into like a YAML per service, I guess. And then we could flip it around and generate the service catalog from those YAMLs. That could be the first thing that we generate, like the service catalog as it stands now. Generated from those YAMLs. And then that's the first thing that we base off our new YAMLs. And then we change the recording rules and alerts to be from the YAML. But this I think we're already further off then, because at that moment when we start generating our recording rules and alerts, I think we want to be kind of like happy with the structure of with the spec of the YAML.
And I guess going through this, I mean, this is probably a good question for you. How much duplication of code do you think we currently have through some of the JSONnet libraries? Do you think there's much of it that we can squash down and create some better shared definitions? Just thinking of cases of like generating Grafana panels that have been done one way in one file and then another way in a different file.
I think there's a whole bunch of stuff like the main dashboards and so on that are basically that's all reused, but then everybody kind of adds stuff to those dashboards, and that's could be like through the generic Graphonet, the old library that we had there. They could be going through the basic thing that we built as an abstraction on top of that, but that's all kind of like manually done. The same thing goes actually for service definitions. Like we've got web API, Git, internal API, AI assisted. Those are all 5 Rails services that share SLIs, WebSocket 6. So they share SLIs, and those are defined somewhere on the side. So that's going to be a lot of repetition. But we're going to see that, and I think that's when it's going to make sense to do something around monitoring units, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, yes, there's a lot of repetition. I think that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, and like I say, when we talk about modularizing some of this, we'll probably find where we can cut some of the bloat and streamline it. Until we do that, it's probably not worth investing too much time in.
The part that we haven't talked about it much here is the saturation points, which are much closer to what you're defining as monitoring units. I don't know if you looked at those definitions in JSONnet. That might be, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, a monitoring unit could be any reusable
it's an SLI
thing, right? Yeah,
exactly. But those are the two that I think will have like the two that we'll start with. I don't know how
Yeah.
many we'll have. Like we'll have an SLI, and SLI like has a description, an operation rate, that kind of thing. Then a monitoring unit for a saturation point that has a numerator denominator kind of definition description. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And short term, I think this is probably the biggest or the easiest win without too much time investment.
Yeah, the only disadvantage that I have with it, like is that it doesn't immediately help people do stuff. But I think what do you think?
I don't really see a great immediate short term in terms of if we're looking at time spent now versus gain later on, versus a easy win now. I don't really see a great super short term solution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, me neither. The only shortcut is the one that you mentioned, where we actually take a bunch of stuff out of the service definition.jsonet files and put it in a YAML that we then turn into a service definition.jsonet. But
yeah, and like
I think that will tie us
from
down to a structure that we already have that we know is not
exactly, yeah, and I think that works. Most people going into those service definitions now, they're not hard to follow. I mean, if there's areas of concern, we can put work on the documentation. I think the problem is when you have to leave that file, that's where the problem happens. And I would say the better question there is if there's things we can expose up to the service definition as a configurable parameter, so they don't have to actually leave that file. Would it be easier than?
I don't fully understand that. Could you? Do you have an example of that?
An example.
I think you mean like where we have a service level indicator, and then Rails request go gets it from another file because it's shared.
Yeah, or examples of like the recent one where we were looking at the regex matches for Mimir. We had quite strict definitions around what the regex patterns would do when they generated that regex or the automatic escaping. And if I said I would like to just feed through a string of raw values for selectors and have the JSON not touch it at all, just don't touch it, just accept my input, I would have to leave out of that file and go and modify that definition somewhere or add a new one, right? Not saying that's a common use case, but I feel like it's those use cases where
it's that
service
surprises
file
you and it doesn't do what you think it might do, and then it's
exactly not. Yeah, and then you have to go hunting, and then you're like, crap, this is getting complicated. So it's those use cases where it's kind of like, how many of those exist? What are common ones where people may have to leave that service definition file? And if so, can we bring that up to the service definition file so it's easier to consume? So yeah, I'm not too sure how common that is, but it's definitely a pattern where I know people would get stuck at that point.
Yeah. One thing that is adding a lot of complication is the well, I'm just thinking about the future because we want to kind of have we want to kind of define a monitoring unit, and then I think we want to write PromQL inside and not generate PromQL. Well, we will want to generate a little bit of PromQL when generating rules, but when you decide define an operation rate, I think SREs would be happier if they could just write a string that is PromQL rather than JSON that generates PromQL.
I think so. Yeah.
So the reason we currently have that in JSON is because we generate a bunch of intermediate rules that we can then reuse. Now that we're on Mimir, do we need those intermediate rules?
Probably not in a lot of cases. I don't think there's any issue with, you know, like if you look at the sloth model, you can go in and you can say, supply me your total metric in a generic error SLI. You'd say, supply me your metric for total, supply me your metric for errors. And then a lot of the boilerplate of adding in the rates or wrapping it up with the rates and the sums, the aggregations can still be done automatically, as long as you can supply in things like additional aggregation labels if I wanted to aggregate on additional labels. It's those cases where we assume the use case for every sum operation that works, like, for example, works at the Prometheus level. And then we move to Mimir and we're like, oh crap, now we need to sum on cluster. So being able to easily have a user consume and just say, I would like to also aggregate on cluster is a much better user experience. So yeah, I think handling a lot of the PromQL is fine, as long as the main parts you would need to configure, i.e. additional label selectors, additional aggregation labels, and the raw metric that you want to feed in are probably the main ones. And then you can still generate the rest of the, you know, the time windows for the different rates that we want to do, all the normal SLI stuff that we do now.
Yep. Okay. So I think we can work with that. But I think we can start, generate something out of there, and then have a discussion on what we want that YAML file to actually look like, because it's not going to be good. It's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, let's start with the generation and see what it looks like.
Yeah. Okay, I'll write that up in that issue, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and I think it's I don't know if we want to spin out a new issue for long-term discussion. But the way I see this is, as we get stuck into it, it's going to evolve and things might become more obvious to us.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we would do, like maybe we'll summarize it on the issue that we currently have, but I think the first project that we want to do is generate that file, and at the end of the project, we want to be able to generate all of the definition that we actually want. So first of all, we will get a hideous, ugly file for each service, and then we'll talk about what we want that actually to look like. And at the end of the project, we're generating the files that we actually want automatically. And it's not really used anywhere yet, but hopefully SREs will use that file to understand what they actually changed, rather than having to go through all of the recording rules. And then in the next step is we start to consume those YAMLs in all of the other things that we want to do, generating alerts, generating recording rules, generating dashboards, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's the next project following on to that. And then once we've done all of that, we can get rid of the service definition JSON files, and we just have the YAMLs that are now used for all of them day to day.
Yep. No, that sounds good to me.
I don't think we can do it in one go. I don't think we can do another Mimir project where we get down into a cave for 6 months.
Absolutely not. No.
Okay.
And yeah, as you say, I think that stepped approach is ideal.
Taliesin, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have any thoughts? Or anything you want to add?
Just listening, really. I think everything got covered, like that I was sort of thinking about. I guess I have more, because I'm so new to all of this, I have more thoughts on what tooling would be easier for new people coming into it, because I guess I really like the idea of pulling this configuration out, so you don't have to dive into the JSONet to sort of configure these services. But I feel like when you do dive in, that experience becomes very daunting very quickly when you're in a,
Traumatizing.
I guess I guess when you're like, it's almost like JSON-Ed is almost like a black box, if that makes sense. Like JSON-Ed is easy enough to read on its own, like if that makes sense. But I guess the run command, you just like, it all goes in and it all comes out, and there's no way to sort of see what's happening. And so I guess long term, that's where I see like a programming language being easier. Because like if we need to bust open that escape hatch and someone needs to come in and dive into the code, whether it's JSON or whatever, if you can just set like a breakpoint at main and start stepping through it, it becomes so much more transparent. But I realize that is not a realistic thing for any sort of short-term goals.
I also don't think that JSON is very well suited for that kind of thing. I think then, and I could like JSON, it is a programming language, but like a more, less like a programming language, Python or whatever, would be easier to do that. But then, yeah.
And what I can't sort of figure out in my head is because like I've come from a developer background and moved towards like platform and infrastructure, and now like SRE is like really in the weeds of ops. And I can't tell if that's like more familiarity with my dev background saying like I want a real programming language, because I have the same pain points with like Terraform, and like everything is just sort of like
Terraform's worse than JSON. Like, sorry.
yeah, 100%. So I can't tell if I'm like yearning for my programming language days because that's a lot more familiar to me, or I'm just like, if it's an actual valid concern, it's like the tooling and the transparency into what actually is happening to generate this is just not there, and it should be there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think this could also get us there, because we can pick how we consume those YAMLs. Like the input becomes something really static, where now it isn't. So
there's also the hybrid model, where one of the complications of JSON-Net, I mean, one of the amazing things of JSON-Net is it's really good at templating for simple use cases. When you start getting really complex use cases, that's when you have nested functions, anonymous functions floating all over the place that become very hard to debug. You can also go down the route of a hybrid model where you take a templating language like JSON-Net for the simple base level templates, and then feed it into something like Go, where you can do more of your advanced sort of function workloads. So you're just bringing in your schema at that point with some very basic templating, and then you can do all your more easier to do in programming language in Go. So you could think of something like Mixtool that does generate lint, and all of that could actually be done through something like Go, with some of the more advanced function stuff that we might want to do.
I don't know if you've noticed, but we do create a bunch of native functions in JSON that are written in Go, and then include them in using your JSON tool thing.
yeah.
That's the other way around. Is also possible.
it's the other way around.
Transparent because, well, yeah.
Okay. You just lose the some of the better niceties of debugging a Go program. But that's an example. So I think longer term we have that option, and we can look at what a simpler developer experience might be like.
I like it that
for me sorry, go ahead.
The static files don't tie us into anything, because if a service owner ends up wanting to generate that file, that's fine. We'll validate it and then consume it.
Yeah. And of course, like short-term, mid-term, we have a lot of investment in what we have in JSON-Net now. So much of what we do is in there that it doesn't make sense to just drop it all. Obviously, we want to be able to reuse everything that we can.
That was actually another question that I had. How much of the things that people find complicated is coming from the fact that we use these multi-window, multi-burn rate alerts, and now confidence ratios, and like it's not as simple. The example that Andrew brought up was where somebody went in and wrote a simple ratio is bigger than 0.1 alert, which is obviously not what we want for experience, like which we've learned in the past. But then so often you need to explain multi-window, multi-burn rates, and then people lose interest, kind of. So I wonder how much is coming from that.
Yeah, and see, this is for me where I think there's a separation between what I would consider operational monitoring, which is the likes of what we have going to the observability alerts channel. It's like something's not right. It's nothing the on-call needs to worry about. It's nothing that's gonna, chomp into our burn rate, our error budget. But there is some impending problem. And it's nice because we can handle it without bothering the EOC. I still think when it comes to our SLIs, our SLOs, our app dexes, the model we have now, and like what Sloth does, where someone just puts in the top, the numerator, the metric for the denominator, and they don't have to think about it apart from maybe thresholds, is really the best way to do it, because not everyone's going to understand how these things work. And we shouldn't expect them to either. I don't think we should expect them to.
No, and I don't think we do now. Like, I think, well, if you have the service definition in its simplest form, it's basically what you're saying, but you need to know the JSON and functions to call to be able to define that, because it's in functions, not structures.
Yeah. Whereas if someone wants something outside of that, we don't really have a mechanism to do that now. And the future would be like, well, here's how you build a monitoring unit or whatever that's called. And you can put everything you want in there, and then that can be consumed. And then, EOC doesn't need to know about it. You can send it to your own little corner of Slack.
Cool. I'll summarize that in the issue, and then we'll take it from there. I think the next step would be starting to write up that project of the outcome that we want in the first step, which is a properly formatted data file.
And it's probably worth highlighting that, it's not going to give instantaneous relief for anyone digesting these changes, but it's par for the course.
Yeah. Cool.
All right.
Okay. Thank everyone for the chat.
Yep. Likewise.
Have a nice evening.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
See ya.